session here would be talking about ways in which we can make our software more accessible and how to audit your software for accessibility. So give it up for Kat.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. So as Abrar said, welcome to my talk, Auditing Your Site for Accessibility, Now What? Today we're going to go through a little bit of backstory on what I'm doing, why I'm here, some caveats about this talk, and then go through the process of identifying your issues, verifying your issues, planning to deal with your issues, and then performing due diligence against your issues. So some backstory. As we said, my name's Kat. I'm a software engineer at American Greetings, and I specialize in building accessible experiences and teaching people how to make their content accessible. I've been doing this with them for about 3 years and some change now. And last year, I was asked by the PyOhio organizers if I could take a look at the PyOhio site and see if it met the WCAG guidelines. And I said yes, and this is my abridged story of how I followed all of these steps, and now we have a more accessible site this year. So my goal is to make sure that you feel better about having to do this yourself, or you are able to support those who do have to do it. So some caveats. This is not an intro talk. I am not going to talk about what accessibility is and why you should care. I am assuming that you have either seen that before in some capacity or you know a little bit about what's going on. We're going to jump right into what the issues are without much discussion about where they come from. The PyOhio site is a small site. It has relatively basic functionality, so the most intensive we're going to get is into form errors and things. We're not going to cover complex interactions today. And you may not be able to do some of the things that I mentioned due to organization rules. You may not have flexibility, and that's okay, but you will know about what you can do for later. Also, I'm not taking questions at the end of this or during this talk. If you want to ask me questions, my Twitter handle is @Passen, all one word. You can tweet them to me, and I will respond to you later, or you can corner me in the hallway. So identifying. This is last year's site. Some of you may recognize it if you came to PyOhio last year. It's simple, it's static. The only portions that were kind of ugly moving parts were the speaker profile submission internals and the program management tools. And yeah, on the surface, like, this is mostly fine, right? The people who are coming to the site for the most part are people who are registering and checking the schedule, and they're attendees. So most of the people who are attending the conference aren't gonna have much issue using this site, even though there's still some stuff that's kind of wrong with it if you know what you're looking for. And I regret not screen capping the internals before we archived the old site because there was a lot of issues with it, and this brings us to our first major caveat of the talk, which is that we dropped the code base. And I know that not all of you can do this, and I'm sorry. But so this screenshot is from last month. The homepage has changed a little bit for the conference today. But now we have a fork of the North Bay Python site, and we are very grateful to them for letting us fork their site. So this is after we did all of the accessibility updates and recolored the site to match the shirts for this year. And just changing the code base alone was not enough, so it got us a lot of the way there. The internals are now way, way less terrifying than the old stuff was, but we still had some work to do, so we needed to do an audit, and we'll talk about how you can use some tools to do things like that. I'm going to do some local demonstrations. There is a specific commit that I'm using from before I fixed a whole bunch of stuff, and it's linked in the speaker notes if you want to ever try this out locally on your own. So identifying. Wave and Axe are both browser extensions that you can use. I'm going to show you how you can use them to do cool stuff. So let's use Wave real quick. Right click, come on. That's pretty readable, right? Okay, so Wave is a browser extension for Chrome and Firefox. It's made by the folks at WebAIM, and you can run it against any page that allows you to do a GET request. It'll evaluate all of the finished built markup. Here we've got some errors. It also tells you about things you did right, such as structural elements, HTML5 and ARIA. You can go into detail and see, ooh, look, here's some things that it's confused about. Here's some things that you did. And there's still alerts. Those aren't necessarily like strict violations of the guidelines, but they're things you should think about. And there's still some errors here if you know what to look for. But it's not explicitly mentioned as such, and we'll talk about why later. And another cool thing that Wave has is a contrast checker. And there's no color contrast issues in the site, even right now, after we fix it, because everything contrasts well against the white background. And that's what it's looking for. But what you can do is you can change this here. At the bottom, you might be able to notice that there's a real-time checker checking the contrast ratio of your text for normal text and large text against all of the AA and AAA rules. And so you can play with it in the page after you select a violated element, and you can see like, hey, these are the colors that are wrong. What do I have to do to make my colors better? So that's cool, but what if you need to actually, test a page that requires a post? Because once you turn off Wave, it refreshes the page, right? That's kind of a problem. So let's take a look at Axe. Axe is really cool. It's made by the folks at DeQ. It lives in your DevTools. You can analyze a page that takes a post because when you use Axe, it doesn't refresh the page or anything. It's just there. It's more than a browser extension. You can use it as a command line thing, but we'll talk about that after a little while. So it doesn't have the whole, hey, here's some things you did right, here's some other things that are in the page, like Wave does. It just looks at things like violations, needs review, rejected, and best practices. So if it isn't sure about something, it'll be like, hey, I don't know if this is an issue or not, and then you can reject it, and it would fall in that rejected category. So these are great. What if you want to test against mobile, which, these are desktop tools. How do you do that? So let's talk about Lighthouse. Lighthouse is a cool thing done by the folks at Google. You can have audits against more than accessibility, so here you can get stuff like performance, check that you've built a proper PWA, you can check for HTML best practices, SEO. Here's something I really like. You can simulate the 3G and 4G network speeds. And it does a pretty good job of this. It actually slows down your CPU on the computer. So let's do that really quick. You can see it just emulates an Android phone. So we got an 100. That's cool, right? Seems legit. But you may be able to notice, that's kind of behind me, so it's a little hard to see. But we have 10 things to additionally manually check that Lighthouse can't figure out for us. We'll talk about those in a bit. We passed 9 audits, so that's cool, but we have 26 that aren't applicable to this page. So that's interesting. So why don't we look at something a little more complicated, like the speaker submission form. So this is the speaker form. You may not have seen it if you didn't submit as a speaker or submit a proposal, and that's okay. So let's check this page really quick with Axe to see if there's anything wrong with it. And it looks the same as the homepage. There's nothing that the tools say is wrong. This is fine, right? But there's still some stuff that's fishy that it's not picking up. And it would be a little bit more obvious if you intentionally cause the page to have an error and reanalyzed it. So it still says that nothing is wrong, right? We've done all our things correctly according to the tools, but this isn't picking up that something is wrong here. If you are using a screen reader or other assistive technology that tries to parse the page for you, it's not going to be able to notice any of this stuff because we didn't do this right just yet. We'll talk about why in a sec. But the thing with tools is that automation can only catch about 1/3 of your potential issues. And this stat varies between 1/4 to 1/3 depending on who you talk to, but not very many of the guidelines can be automated. Things like color contrast, making sure that you have properly structured your markup, those are easy, but things like, does your video have appropriate captions? Does your image have appropriate alt text? Did you hook up your errors in your form correctly? These are things that you can't get tools to test for because the tools cannot make assumptions for you. So you have to manually check these out yourself to make sure that they're okay. So let's talk about verifying. So let's go backwards a bit. Lighthouse gave us a good springboard for checking out and verifying things, so let's go back and take a look at Lighthouse again. And let's do desktop this time with no throttling. Okay, so out of these steps that it will tell us that we have to manually verify, there's a couple that are extremely easy. Gonna zoom this in a bit. So steps 1, 2, 4, and 7 are all super easy, especially in this case, because all you need to test them is a keyboard. Does the page have a logical tab order? Are the interactive controls keyboard focusable? Is user focus not trapped in a region? Does the visual order on the page follow the actual DOM order? And because most of this page is generated by a Django model, we got that for free because it's using all of the right stuff already. It's using the correct inputs. It's using buttons. It's not making clickable divs. Please don't make clickable divs. They're terrible. So we don't have to worry about retesting those because we know that those are already free. But we don't necessarily know about how well this works with assistive technology. So I'm going to turn on VoiceOver. You know what's coming.
Yeah.
So
VoiceOver on Chrome. PyOhio vertical line. Create speaker profile. Google Chrome Canary window. Name. Required invalid data. Edit text as keyboard focus. You are currently on.
okay, so I don't know how well you can hear it, which is why I put this down here on the screen. You may notice that it didn't read out as you would like it to appear in the conference program.
Space.
So remember how I mentioned errors.
Code of conduct. Required check.
Stop. You may remember that I mentioned something about errors, so let's talk about that too.
PyOhio vertical line. Create speaker profile. Web content. You are currently on web content.
There is an error that says this field is required, but it did not read that out to me. So I may not know that this field was required and that I screwed it up and that I was just redumped on this page. Well, why? If I tab back to that field.
Link. Space. Selected. You are currently on space.
VoiceOver is strange sometimes.
Link. Name. Required invalid data. Edit text. You are currently on a text field inside of.
It still doesn't know there's an error because we did not programmatically link these together. So what the tools cannot tell you, but what the screen reader can, is that there is extra ARIA markup that you need to do for all of your hints and all of your errors so that people can understand, hey, there's something wrong here that you need to fix. So that was cool.
VoiceOver off.
Thanks, VoiceOver. So I'm showing you this like in this form because this one's really easy to just get the error to pop up. But it wasn't just this form, it was every form because all of these were built in the same way. So all of these forms have the same kinds of errors. So that covers these. Keyboard testing you can kind of figure out on your own. Screen reader testing is a little more complicated until you get used to it. But you want to hear out the kinds of things that you see, and that's what's important. But what other things can we do? So browser zoom is a cool one. People will change the font size on your site all the time. You're never going to know unless they tell you, but it is a thing that people do. And one of the WCAG 2.1 requirements is supporting up to 400% zoom. And on desktop, what that looks like, you get a viewport about the size of my iPhone SE. And people do that. And the nice thing about testing out your stuff with zoom is that you can see if your layout starts to break down anywhere and if you failed to be truly responsive. And this isn't the same as what you may have seen yesterday at a British talk with the screen magnification. This is just blowing up the viewport so that it fills like the entire screen and shrinks down. And using touch devices, you can also additionally, beyond verifying, oh, your mobile layout looks okay, that you didn't accidentally do things like overlap your tap targets. Have you ever tried to use a site that had some links or things that you wanted to click, but when you tried to click them, nothing happened? So by doing this way, you can verify like, oh, somebody's able to actually go through and do everything, and you can kind of do that through mobile emulation, but not entirely. So testing on an actual device is super important. Should we full screen this for a bit? Okay, so this is not an all-encompassing tour because we don't have time. All of this stuff that I've done was like 2 or 3 days work that I've condensed into the first 13 minutes of this talk. And remember that this site is small. Going through and finding all of the, quote, easy issues that are in your site is going to take you some time, and that's okay. As an example, to show you like how much harder it could actually be, to do a full audit of a site using as many tools as I have at my disposal and historical knowledge of all the system states that I can think of, for my day job, it still takes me about 3 days to generate a like audit list for a site, for a larger site. And I've been doing this for a little while and I'm pretty familiar with what I'm doing, right? So you may be looking at this like, oh no, I've got this humongous list of stuff and I'm never gonna know how to get started and it's just gonna take me so much longer. And that's not how it's gonna be. So let's talk about making a plan. So how do you handle this list that you've now created? We're going to get a little bit more conceptual, and I'll talk about some high-level stuff, and then I'm going to bring it back to what I did for the PyOhio site here. So maybe you've got many small changes, death by 1,000 cuts, tons of contrast errors. How do you do that? You could do it by page. So take a page and say, I'm going to fix every single thing on this page. Okay. Maybe then you've changed some stuff that has become global and you can reuse that elsewhere. And as you go, each page is going to have less and less that you need to change for it. Or you can organize by flow and say, I'm going to go through my checkout flow and make sure that everything in this flow is A-OK. And by doing so, you could probably write some stuff that you can reuse later and say, well, I wrote this function that encompasses validation for this checkout form, but it also has reusability in other places, and then you just slowly bolt on more and more cases that you can make it a more global script as you go. Maybe you've got a whole ton of large changes. Maybe you don't have the leeway to just dump in an entire flow's worth of change without breaking things. There is no shame in long-term feature branches. I've had to do this, and it's way, way easier to spend a whole ton of time testing things in a branch, making sure that everything is A-OK, and verifying that separately, and then merging back in to make sure that when you pull develop back in or something, that you've not shattered everyone else's changes. Like, it's very important. So you can also use, like, these are the two things that I like using as a lens to kind of figure out, like, how do I want to attack this? How do I want to approach this? And you can use these to also set some goals for yourself, such as things like percentage or numeric value of defects closed. If you're using an issue tracker, then you can be like, hey, let's base all of our burn down charts on this and say we want this line to go down as we go. Maybe as you get further along, you don't want to have any regressions in a particular area. So you've done things like, well, we cleaned up this flow, and now as we add more things to it, just as new features, we don't want to have any regressions here. Or maybe you've gone through the entire thing now and you're like, hey, I'm done. For each new feature that you add, you could make a goal of saying, I want to learn one new thing about this with accessibility that I can bring back to other parts of my site and add in later. So this file that I'm going to go through in a moment is the site.js file. I have linked the master version off the PyOhio website GitHub, but you can go find it yourself. It's easy. It's not a single commit. But for the PyOhio site, for the most part, I work through page by page. And that's kind of because this happened. How many people have done this? There is no shame in doing this.
Tell me what I'm not supposed to have done.
This block body business is just dumping all of the Django stuff into the page, and there's no markup for this page beyond like that div class container.
This is the base template file.
This is a base template file for almost every page on the site. So normally what I would do is like, okay, I'm going to go find this template. I'm going to carefully mark up this form because it has some very specific things about it. I'm going to put some conditionals in my template because I don't like doing all of this in JavaScript. It's very, very painful. It relies on people having JavaScript available, which not everybody does, especially if you're on a bad connection, conference Wi-Fi, you're terrible. And this was not fun to go around, so that's why we had to do this file. These are all the functions I had to write to bolt on accessibility to the site, because all of these forms act slightly differently.
Oh, yeah.
And all of these run on load based on what page, because we can't target anything with the backend without things getting really, really strange. So most of these are short, right? Like, so for the home page here, if you sign up, it dumps you back on the home page with a little Bootstrap banner that says, hey, thanks for signing up, check your email. You don't get anything out of that for free, right? You have to strap a role alert on that, or else people aren't going to know why they got dumped on the home page. So now it'll alert out, and the assistive technology will read, oh, hey, thanks for registering. Go check your email. So, you know, stuff was short like that, and then some of these things weren't. This is the sign-up form, and I really just wanted to show this for the comment here, which I'll read out to you because it might be hard to see. This form is complicated. It can have a global error. It can have an inline error. And the global error doesn't directly tie to an input, and the user potentially has to error twice to hear them both. There's a lot of guessing going on in here, and this looks ugly, and maybe your fixes will look like that, and that's okay. For bolting things backwards on and retrofitting, it's totally fine for your code to be ugly, but what this does is it informs you that your design is flawed. Something has gone wrong here, that you need to take a step back later on and say, how can we make this better so that we don't have to do crazy guessing to say, I think this person has this kind of error, so I'm going to try to guess and say, oh, well, I think that you might have done your password wrong, but I'm not certain. Retrofits are ugly by nature. That's how all of this is. I've had to do this in my professional life. I've had to do this in my casual life, and that's okay. By the way, remember the speaker form? It's very similar looking, but it's also a lot simpler because we only have help blocks and we have error blocks. And they all kind of hook up the same. So snag the errors, attach them to whatever input they came from, give them an alert. If there was a help text, then we also want to hitch the help text. So now, when you tab through the form, if you tab onto name, and there's an error, it will tell you the field is required. Please enter your name as you would like it to appear in the program. And that's handy. Is this perfect? No. This isn't perfect, but this is a lot better than where we used to be. So now what? We did some things, we ran tests, we have a plan, we fixed some things. That's cool. So where do we go from here? This is ambiguous in keeping fixing. Tools are going to give you suggestions on how to fix things, but you still have to do usability testing regularly, right? Maybe you fixed some things and need to see if you broke it. Try the before and after, see if it's better, see if it's worse. Good example of this is now the speaker submission form. Before it would not read out the help text, now it does. Now it reads the errors, so it's a lot easier to use. Keeping on testing, you still have to make sure that things didn't break, right? Websites aren't static. Every time that you push a change or a release, you have the potential to undo your progress, to take things backwards. So manually checking yourself is good, but that's also time consuming, and we don't like spending all of our time testing. So how do we do that? Let's talk about future-proofing. If you have a CI step or other way to run automation, this is your best bet. So you can have services run against your CI site to do regressions for you, and that's really cool. So a couple of options that I have here. Pali, I believe is how you pronounce it. I'm probably wrong. Numeronyms are great. But you can stand Pali up on its own, and all you need to do to get it going is feed it a sitemap. It'll go by itself. You can tell Jenkins to run it. And then it will go through all of your URLs, spider through, and run as many tests as it can against them. If you have things like authentication in the way, you can configure it to do things like, hey, please put this sign-in name in, put this password, and then go through the login, and when the page gets to this point, then test it. So you don't have to worry about missing out on things that are behind authentication, just there's a little bit of setup to it. Axe Core is also great. It's like the browser and command line Axe, except you can use it in a CI environment, and it also spiders to a site, but you want to use it with a test runner instead, because it works well with things like Jasmine, and they list on their site like all the test runners they work with. There's a lot of them. It's a little more intensive because you have to write your own tests for the most part, right? Like it'll still test like basic things, but it's more of a functional testing thing. If you already have functional tests, I feel this is well worth the investment because you can just layer this on top of that. If you're already testing, hey, I can successfully sign in, then you can say, hey, and now validate this page. And that's really handy because otherwise this is a whole lot of manual work. I chose these two because they are the ones that I am most familiar with. However, there are other options. Some of them are paid, some of them aren't. And I encourage you to explore all of those on your own time. So, resources. As I've said, Wave, Axe, Lighthouse, Pali, Axe Core, and I've also listed a whole bunch of stuff in the speaker notes at the end of the last slide. Thank you.